Well, our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Ambassador Leonidas Chrysanthopoulos, a very distinguished servant of his country's foreign service. CIB has long taken a sympathetic interest in the appalling situation forced on Greece by the EU authorities, imposing conditions of hardship, depression and slump, at least as bad as the 1930s. Jim Reynolds, our Honorary Secretary, visited the meeting of EPAM, the United People's Front in Athens, and was greatly impressed both by the seriousness of the situation, the warmth of his reception, and the commitment of the members of EPAM. And we were recently pleased to join in a demonstration outside the Greek embassy in London in support of EPAM and the Greek people on March the 25th, the day of the European Union's 60th birthday. Well, they may have had something to celebrate, but Greece certainly didn't. So I was delighted when Ambassador Chrysanthopoulos accepted our invitation to speak here. He has a distinguished record in the Greek Foreign Service, having been Secretary General of the Organization of Black Sea Economies, as well as his country's ambassador to several prominent countries. And he's now the spokesman for EPAM to the wider world. So, Your Excellency, we look forward to hearing your views on the Greek and European situations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank the Campaign for Independent Britain and Edward Spalton for inviting me to speak today, and also to express my gratitude for the support given by you at the March 25th protest at the Greek embassy, which, by the way, was also our national day when we started our war of independence against the Ottomans. Now, my situation is a little bit strange because as a junior diplomat, I was part of the delegation that negotiated our accession to join the EC. But it was a different EC at the time. And our reasons for joining at the time, which was our negotiations essentially started in 1976, and we finished in 1978. We joined in 1981, were threefold. The first was that we were leaving from a period of a dictatorship of 7 years. And the EC at the time was a democratic institute, and during the dictatorship, it had played a great role in undermining the colonels. First of all, they froze the association agreement that we had. They froze the protocol, the financial protocol, and bilaterally, member states of the EU intervened to the junta to release political prisoners that had been imprisoned, prominent. So that was one issue. So we wanted to join in order to stabilize our democracy. The second reason was Turkey. Turkey had just invaded back in '74 Cyprus. NATO could not give us any kind of protection because Turkey was a member state, and NATO does not deal in differences between member states. And so the only moral and economic protection that we could get was against Turkey was by being a member of the EU while Turkey was not. And it helped us a little bit in various circumstances. For example, when, we were able to bring Cyprus into the European Union, and when the Dektash, the Turkish Cypriot regime, declared the state of northern Cyprus, the EU refused to recognize it. Of course, we helped the EU to recognize it, but they did at the end. And the third reason was economic. And there we made our mistake because we thought that by joining the EU, we would develop better our economy, we become more competitive, and that's where we made our mistake. But of course, it is good to remember that at that time, the EC was actually functioning. We had ministers, the ministers of foreign affairs, who were people who had a vision. And they were capable people also, because they were able by themselves, without the help of experts, to solve agricultural problems by themselves, finding political solution on agricultural problems, on the budget, which is a very complicated issue. They were dealing it by themselves. I remember one conversation where I was present in a meeting where Chesson, the French foreign minister, made a proposal, I don't remember now on what issue it was, and then Genscher said that it's a very good proposal, Claude, but you know, in 30 years we will have this negative result. I mean, these were people that were looking into the far future, and they were actually interested in what the EC was doing. And also, it was, at that time, a democratic, it had democratic mechanisms and was actually working primarily for the interest of the people rather than for the bankers as it has developed today. Okay, that was Greece. Now, a little bit before I continue to go into it, just to say a few words about my political party, EPAM, the Unified Popular Front. It was created in 2011 from the demonstrations of 2010 and 11 and 12. It's a patriotic party in the good sense, aiming for the liberation of Greece by leaving the EU and the Eurozone, and by sending to justice those responsible for the destruction of Greece. Our members come from the left, from the center, and from the right. So it's difficult for Greeks to understand why we're not a right-wing party or a left-wing party, but they will have to learn that these are characteristics that no longer exist anymore. I mean, I think we should go better to the old system that we had of conservative parties and liberal parties, rather than this right-left thing, which creates lots of confusion. And now, how could the situation, well, I would like to start a little bit with the onerous debt, because what we are accused, our so-called debt is actually an onerous debt that cannot be justified. But I would like to quote some interesting things that I found from the British Museum here. That the debt first presents itself in Mesopotamia, around 2500 before Christ. And in the British Museum, we can read the following, it's written in inscription. Puzurum, son of Ilikandari, received from the god Samas 38 1/6 shekels of silver. He will pay interest according to what Samas would indicate. Samas was the god. He will pay back the silver and the interest at the time of the recall. That was fair. Hammurabi, in his code, made it even more fair. He says, if one has debt and the god Adad floods his field or his record is destroyed, then that year he will not pay wheat to his lenders and no interest for that year. So there was a system of taking into consideration emergencies. We're speaking about a long time ago. And unfortunately, humanity is losing its memory, if it had it. How could it have been avoided? Before I go into how Greece was destroyed, how could it have been avoided? Well, there were alternative ways which the Eurozone could have brought the adjustment, and this could have been done mainly by Germany. If German wages and prices had risen, the value of the euro would have fallen, and the crisis countries could have become more competitive globally. But Germany said no. They didn't want to have the burden of adjustment. That should rest on the crisis countries, they said. By blaming the crisis countries and focusing on fiscal deficits, Germany and the rest misdiagnosed the problem. What was and is needed is not structured reform of the individual countries, as structured reform of the entire Eurozone. And why should anybody believe that these austerity measures that failed elsewhere would succeed in Greece? One, reasons of ideology, deeply held beliefs about how the economy functions, which change little, if at all, as evidence against these beliefs increase. Maybe a political agenda bringing down left-wing governments, teaching electorates in other countries the consequences of electing such governments, and making more likely that an economic and social conservative agenda would prevail. It may have also been the case that responsible officials in the Eurozone would make an entire nation suffer simply because they disagree with a country's choice of leader, just out of spite. So what has happened in Greece, what is the result of all these measures that have been taken is the basic thing: the death rate has increased dramatically. We have 438 deaths per day in Greece, while in 2006 it was 287 per day, which is the natural death rate. From 1940 to 1946, during the war and famine years, the population was reduced by 87,860. From 2011 to 2016, it has been reduced by 115,000 people. We have deaths more than births, and from January until April 24, the deaths were 44,059, while during the same period in 2010, it was around 15,000. Deaths were 70,830 in 2013 and reached 118,623 in 2017. So we are speaking here about a destruction of the killing of human beings. It's a form, I'll be very polite here, of a genocide, what's happening in Greece. And we are supposedly members of this beautiful organization called the European Union. We also have gross violation of human rights in Greece. We have the reports of two independent experts who, both of them, mentioned the violations of human rights that are taking place in Greece. Also, we should take into consideration that ECOSOC condemned Greece in October 2015 and asked that austerity measures be progressively waived and that protection of the rights under the Covenant of Economic and Social and Cultural Rights is enhanced. Now, I would just like to mention here that the measures that have been imposed upon Greece by the EU have failed, and they're destroying Greece. Greece as a state is in a much worse position today than when it was in 2010, when the austerity measures were adopted. Public debt as a percentage of GNP increased from 148.3% in 2010 to 156.9% in 2012 to 175% in 2015, being 180% in 2016. So this is why we took the measures to abolish this public debt. And instead of abolishing it, it's increasing. Unemployment soared from 9% in 2009 to 25% in 2015, while over 60% of the youth are unemployed. Suicides have increased by 45%. The reasons for the massive failure of the measures are mainly the fact that the human factor was never taken into consideration. The citizen of Greece was totally ignored, and as a result, Greece is facing a social catastrophe and an imposed humanitarian crisis. From the outset, it was clear to many that the measures would not be effective. But those in charge of planning and implementing them refused to listen to reason, and even after acknowledging the mistakes. For example, the IMF accepted the mistake of the fiscal multiplier. Mistakes have been admitted by the European Commission, which nevertheless refused to correct them. As far as human rights violations are concerned, I mentioned just briefly about the two reports by the independent experts on the effects of foreign debt and other related international financial obligations of states on the full enjoyment of human rights, of Cephas Lumina and Pablo Bohoslavsky. So they speak about these violations, but not only have the international human rights agreements been violated, but also the EU Treaty of Lisbon. These violations have been instigated by the Greek governments, which have also violated the Greek constitution, the member states of the Eurozone, the EU as an institution, and the IMF. They all share the responsibility for human rights violations. For some examples, I don't want to tire you very much, Articles 2 and 3 have been violated of the Lisbon Agreement. Article 2 says that the Union is founded on the values of respect of human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. Article 3, paragraph 1, the Union's aim is to promote peace, its values, and the well-being of its peoples. How can one speak of respect for human dignity when an ever-increasing number of Greek citizens are foraging the garbage in search of food or are patiently waiting in food queues? And I can continue mentioning articles that are being violating, but I don't want to do that. I don't want to tire you with that. I would just like also to mention, as just a nice example, my case. I mean, when I left the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'll be very frank with you, I had a pension of 3,500 euros, which was my money. I mean, it was money that I paid for my salary over the 38 years that I was in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, this has been reduced to 1,200 euros. I cannot survive with that. So what do? I don't pay taxes. I don't pay taxes because I cannot pay taxes. I don't do it out of political disobedience. I just can't. And there are 5 other million people in my situation. And my 1,200 euros are considered a very big pension today in Greece. And this is a mistake, I would like to say here, of the capitalist system. And I say capitalist system, I'm not a communist myself, but it is a mistake, because I do not think that pensions should be included as should be included in the budget of any country as a debt, because it is not a government expenditure. It is money that goes from the people and is automatically transferred to other people who are having pensions. So if you delete that from the budget of any government, then any debt that the country has goes down. And it's totally illegal to take our pensions because it's our money. It's highway robbery, this thing. So now, what we are doing as EPAM, what actions we have taken. I have visited the Ministries of Foreign Affairs of the Benelux countries in Berlin and the UN in Geneva, where in the UN we initiated the complaint procedure against all Greek governments at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva for human rights violations. We're still waiting. It's about 1.5 years now. Hopefully this will be examined in August. We had the March 25th demonstrations outside the embassies of the Greece in The Hague, London, and Paris. And our Secretary General Dimitris Kazakis continues his visit in all of Greece. And the other practical measure that we are doing is that we are preventing the auctions of property at the courts. Now, this is a big issue because many people who have taken loans during the good old days, because of the over-taxation, because of the reduction of salaries and pensions, they can no longer pay their mortgages. So the state and the banks are trying to take over their property, which is, we find, totally illegal, because the Greek constitution has been violated to such an extent that it doesn't exist anymore. So we gather every Wednesday when these auctions take place at the courts of first justice of Greece, and we physically prevent these auctions from taking place. We prevent from the lawyers from coming in and making the announcement. As a result, the regime is now thinking of doing these auctions electronically. And there again, we are working out a system that will flood the electronic thing with requests, with bids that are not true bids, but just paper bids that might block it, and also of hacking the system. So we're working towards this. For the moment, the Greek regime is not in a position to implement this, and we continue that. But this is where now we will have the first violence that will occur. And I would like to let you know that most Greeks are armed. And we started becoming armed, not because we had any bad intentions, but basically to protect ourselves from crimes that were happening. Burglars were coming, all that. And now, what I anticipate is, and this is what I tell the police when we meet in the courts, we tell them that it's your interest to allow us to prevent these auctions, because if these auctions take place, the next step would be that you will have armed police, Greek or German, we don't know. They will come to the houses to remove the people by violence. And those people in the houses are armed. And we outside are armed. So this is where the first shooting would start. And we don't want that to happen. And some police agreed to that argument that we tell them, because naturally they don't want to be shot. Now, what is the solution? We have, as EPAM, we have proposals for a solution that an EPAM government would do. The first thing would be the denunciation as an odious debt of the May 2010 memoranda on the basis of international law, and particularly the Vienna Treaty on Treaties, Article 48 to 52, anticipate under which conditions an international agreement is null and void. So what do we do there is, as soon as we become government, we sent a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, who is the keeper of international agreements, and we tell them we implement Articles 48 and 52, and that's that. He might send us an accusé de réception, he might not send us, depending on the pressures that he gets, but from that moment, we are not obliged to continue paying these stupid installments. But at the same time, we nationalized the Bank of Greece. And we nationalized the Bank of Greece in order that we control it, that we become masters of our economy, and also to use the assets of the Bank of Greece for supporting the economy. And these assets, according to the information and the statistics of the Bank of Greece, are about 82 billion euros. About 50 billion in cash, and the other are in English and Luxembourg titles, which can be easily sold. Yes, then of course, this implies an exit from the Eurozone and from the European Union. We will follow your example and use an Article 50 clause and introduce a national currency gradually. Now, I had discussed the national issue of the national currency. I had discussed it with the then president of UKIP, with Mr. Farage, 3 or 4 years ago when we met in Brussels. And he told me, on how you do it, I don't know. He was very honest about it. So we figured it out. What will we do is that we will continue using, for a short period of time, the euro that is circulating. And we will create an electronic euro, which we will fill the accounts of the pensioners and of the salaries. And that will be done electronically, so there will be no question of devaluation or anything. Life will continue for 8 months until we start printing our normal national currency, etc. And also, we will impose capital controls, because we don't want any money that we will need in Greece to start flying outside for a certain period. We will abolish the internal debts of the private sector, of those people whose homes are being taken over or being auctioned. We will reduce the taxation to 2009 levels, and in this way, there will be money to have the economy working again. And of course, we intend to render justice by putting on trial those politicians that violated the Greek constitution, and there are very many. And also, we shall call for a constituent assembly to create a new constitution. This is our program. Now, the Greeks are becoming more and more attentive to this program. But despite of that, they're still afraid of it. They're afraid about the national currency. And of course, there's the state propaganda that all the time tells them. I mean, we had the governor of the Bank of Greece, who in Parliament 2 weeks ago said that if we go to national currency, all Greeks will be arrested at the borders. This is the governor of the Bank of Greece who said that in Parliament, and nobody laughed. That was the tragedy of it. Now, I think that I covered most of the Greek story, but I would like to speak a little bit about the UK negotiations. As a junior diplomat, I was going to the UK negotiations to ask them how they negotiated the entry. And my UK colleague was giving me all the information, all the things that were necessary, etc. But things have changed now. And if I was still a junior diplomat, I would go to the UK delegation to ask them how they're preparing to go out. Now, I would like to tell you that I fear that the EU is preparing a big show by by presenting positions, negotiating positions that will be unacceptable for the UK, on practically everything, just so that this will be an example to any other country that tries to use the Article 50 not to use it. And I would also like to remind you, because I was part of the Greek delegation when we discussed Article 50, why Article 50 was put into the Lisbon Agreement, basically for one reason: to resolve the economic aspects, the financial aspects of it, because all member states participate with contributions in the EU budget. So at a certain moment, you have to know when you're going out how much you will get or how much more you have to pay in order to get out. That's all, nothing else. All the other things that they're inventing now is something that could be resolved bilaterally between the countries concerned. And this is why I would like to tell you that if you see at a certain moment that the issue becomes untenable, just drop the Article 50 and make a unilateral departure. You might lose some money out of that, but you will retain your dignity. That's very important. I think I've covered basically everything. Yes, one more issue which concerns humanity. I have proposed at very many instances, but nobody cares about it, that humanity examines the deletion of the global debt, which at this moment is about $600 trillion. We have had examples in the past. We had it in ancient Greece. We had also in the ancient Hebrew societies, where after 50 years all debts were deleted. And back in the 70s, we had it when the developed countries deleted the debt of the non-aligned movement, which allowed Yugoslavia at that time to take off economically. By doing this, we reset humanity on a new basis, and all this warmongering will stop, or might stop, hopefully. But we don't have politicians who have the guts to do that and to prevail over the directions that they're receiving from the bankers. That's the big problem. And the UK, and I think that the best forum to do that would be within the G7, where the UK participates. And I think that perhaps when you become government one day, you might raise it. It's something for humanity. It's not for the EU or anything. It's something much bigger. And I think that humanity needs it. Thank you very much. That's all.